Our top story at this hour, leaders of the world's richest 7 nations are locked behind closed doors as they discuss a plan to rebuild the world's economy. Leaders also expected to adopt a health declaration that is aimed at planning better for future pandemics. SABC News correspondent Laura Makin-Isherwood is there.
When Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, gave his opening remarks, opening the first session yesterday, he talked about building back better. He said that would be done through climate, obviously through the pandemic, and also with regards to equality. That, he says, is a real issue for him, a real sort of high up on his own agenda in terms of getting girls and vulnerable children back into schools. There was a £430 million pledge to try to help that. And that will be a call that he's then putting out to G7 leaders and those guest nations to try to encourage them too to try to get girls and vulnerable children back into school. Also, he was speaking about the climate. That, of course, has been a massive topic of discussion here too. We've seen protesters walking through the streets across Cornwall trying to really make their point, saying that G7 leaders need to do more. And it seems like the idea is to bring those nations together and really bring about an idea, a plan to bring about better jobs, more investment into different countries when it comes to climate and pushing forward in a green way. And of course, the pandemic. Key to recovering economically, globally from this pandemic will be working together, coming together on trade and also on vaccines. We know that there has been a donation, a pledge made by the US President Joe Biden to give 500 million vaccines to different countries that have struggled to get access to them so far. The UK has pledged to give 100 million, but we've heard rumours that by the end of this weekend there could be a huge sum, a huge total of 1 billion vaccines offered to different nations over the course of the next 2 years to try to get more of the world vaccinated and recover from this pandemic more quickly. Well, yeah, often there is a lot of criticism, isn't there? The G7 leaders and leaders from other nations, those guest nations that have been invited, might come together, and this is just talking. It's not necessarily putting any policy together, but we know that the idea behind this is try to set a route for the future, try to come together, agree on certain pathways that all these nations want to take, because they say that it's better to work that out together and more progress will be made. We know that US President Joe Biden, after obviously the last few years of having Donald Trump representing America at these talks, wants to bring back a sense of calm, a sense of unity. He wants to encourage a feeling of alliance, and that, I think, will be a real pro to this summit if nations do come together and agree on certain points moving forward. Yeah, vaccine equity has been a really big priority for South Africa, we know, and of course President Ramaphosa arrived here in the UK last night. He is joining discussions this afternoon on how these nations would come together and plan for future pandemics, how they would respond to those. We know that a Carbis Bay agreement may be on the table, an agreement between these leaders as to how they would throw all their resources possible into planning and preparing a response to any future pandemics within 100 days, which is quite a target. Of course, President Ramaphosa and South Africa has been really fundamental in trying to garner support for extra funding to ensure equitable access to vaccines. South Africa, along with India, is proposing a waiver on intellectual property rights on those vaccines, trying to make sure that it's easier for different nations that currently have little access to produce them, manufacture them more cheaply and more easily. Of course, that's going to be a big push from them this afternoon in this summit. Whether or not they succeed, I don't know. But of course, that big figure of possibly 1 billion vaccines, 1 billion doses being donated between the G7 leaders will at least be a step forward on that.
Right, we continue with our G7 coverage on the SABC. We are joined by Daily Maverick's associate editor, Brook Spector, to chat further. Oh, a very good evening. Thank you for joining us. I mean, we've seen the President of the United States, Joe Biden's first appearance at the G7 summit. I mean, clearly his intentions are to win the hearts and minds of the leaders. In your opinion, has he done that?
Well, I mean, let's be clear about what Joe Biden's task was after the last 4 years of sharp elbows and sharper tongue. Joe Biden is spending considerable amount of energy, not just at the G7 meeting, but also at the subsequent European Union and NATO leaders summits, trying to reestablish the idea that the United States is a responsible, reliable, cogent, coherent ally and supporter, and that it works together with its allies, friends, and other kinds of relationships. It's not that it's an uphill climb, it's just that the last 4 years gave people such pause that it's work. And Joe Biden, that's, to be fair, is good at that kind of thing. He's very good face to face, not just across a table, but literally within the reach of a handshake. And the European nations and Japan obviously want to establish that kind of rapport and relationship. So going forward, that's easier. That's not pushing a huge rock up the hill as much as it's trying to get level territory to work on their behalf. But there are contentious issues both within the summit and then going forward, of course, to the June 16 meeting with Vladimir Putin. Let's be clear, too, that as your correspondent from Cornwall was saying, this is a meeting in which there is no operating established way to take an agreement and turn it into actual policy by actual nations, because it isn't an organization. It's not a legislature. It's not a permanent establishment. It's a group of relatively like-minded world leaders coming together to try to thrash out some ideas. And the key ones for audiences here, I suspect, are obviously climate change agreement, the vaccines and their relationship to COVID, restarting and reigniting the economy globally. And one that's not getting enough coverage, I think, is the broader agreement among the nations that multinational companies should not be able to become exempt from corporate income tax by cleverly shifting their domicile from one nation to the next so as to escape corporate taxes. That was talked about at the finance ministers meeting I'm trying to remember exactly, a couple of weeks back. And there is effectively agreement on that as a principle, but that's still an abstract concept. Making that work is something the tax lawyers are going to have a great deal of fun with.
Well, you've made, you've alluded to some of the issues that will be discussed this weekend, including climate change and economic recovery, vaccine rollouts as well. He, of course, making a huge announcement that the U.S. will donate 500 million vaccine dosages to about 100 poor countries. Are we likely perhaps to see other countries follow suit?
Well, I mean, part of the problem is supply and availability. That 500 million doses from the U.S. as part of what is ostensibly 1 billion doses is clearly dependent on the capabilities of the companies and countries to make them. If you'd made that pledge 6 months ago, people would have said that's very nice, but where are they going to be made and how are they going to be made and who's going to do it? Now the capabilities to make these things have been geared up rather significantly, and doses are beginning to pour out of plants, and I guess we still call them factories where they're made. But the question will be twofold. One is the actual creation of the vaccines, but two, getting them to countries which will have the established infrastructure to get vaccines from the case into the arm. And that's a whole lot easier to say than it is to do. Because you need secure storage, and in many cases cold chains. You need the organizational capability to move large amounts of these things and other stuff to places all over a country, whatever country it is, and then the infrastructure to organize many millions of people to show up and get the vaccine. So simply making them and pledging to deliver it is one thing, but actually putting it into arms, that becomes a significant problem as well.
which has also been a criticism that some of these summits and meetings across the globe have faced. But Brooks, perhaps in conclusion, let me look at South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, also in attendance. Do you think he'll be able to influence leaders on the much talk about intellectual property waiver on COVID-19 vaccines? What is your take?
Well, I mean, let's realize one thing, that there isn't international agreement on a TRIPS waiver. There are some countries that are very strongly opposed to it. And any statement that will come out of the G7 is a statement that presupposes unanimity among the attendees. You don't have, like you might in a court, at say the U.S. Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court in South Africa, you don't have a majority and a minority opinion. You either have an agreement or you don't. And if you don't, then that says volumes too. I think President Ramaphosa is going to make his best possible case, but the case has got to be made with the understanding that this is not a blanket removal of patent protections for all vaccines, but only for this particular disease and these vaccines for a limited period until the pandemic breaks.
Yeah.
That may be more palatable for countries that are at this point not convinced. Germany, I note, is one of those, and Switzerland, which is not at the meeting, but which also makes a great many vaccines, apparently is opposed as well. I think you should wait also to see what comes out of the European Union meeting, which Joe Biden will also attend in the coming week, whether or not the opinion shifts in the direction you're asking about. Because you are in fact saying that Cyril Ramaphosa would be able to convince a large group of nations and the companies in them, individual companies, they're not government companies, making a decision which is startlingly different from their normal way of acting in terms of the protections of patents for medicines and other pharmaceutical products. And so that's not something that's going to happen, with a snap of the fingers or an impassioned speech by one guest president.
All right, Daily Maverick's associate editor Brook Spector will leave the conversation there. Again, just joining us for an update on the latest emerging from the G7 summit.